In this webinar, we're going to discuss how to read textbooks and technical material. I'm Paul Nowak, the founder of Iris Reading, and this is a particular topic that I think you'll find interesting because a lot of people have questions on how to get comprehension when they're reading very, very dense, very technical, sometimes even boring material, but they have to read it for work. Maybe they have to read it for school. So there are a number of ways that we can get better comprehension. And I want to start with this basis of what we discussed in previous webinars about the multiple reading process, where you preview, overview, read, do a final review, and then maybe recite or talk about something. We can apply this to textbooks. Actually, this process is ideal for reading textbooks or technical material. And I want to discuss some different ways that we can tweak the process. Ultimately, you're going to customize it for your own material, but I want to give you some ideas in this webinar how you can do so, and all the various things and issues and challenges that come up when we are reading technical material. So when you first get the book, before you start reading any chapters, you should preview the entire book. So if you're a student, at the beginning of every semester you get a syllabus. At the beginning that first week, what I recommend you do is you read the introduction and summary of each and every single chapter. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, we want to get an idea, what is this whole book going to discuss? We already know that by the title, but we can actually get a lot of good information by just reading introductions and conclusions to every chapter. And don't worry if, when you're reading the introductions and conclusions, they're assuming sometimes that you read the chapter or the previous chapters. Don't worry if you're not getting perfect information. At the very most, you'll be able to get an idea of what's going to be happening throughout this textbook as I start reading it. Now, let's say you don't have to read the entire textbook. I do understand sometimes a syllabus will not have you read every single chapter. Well, maybe you just read the introduction and summary of the chapters that you're going to have to read during that semester. Now, if you're not a student and you're just reading technical material, it's still a good idea to kind of break down that entire book. So I do like reading the introduction and summary of every chapter before I start reading the entire book, chapter by chapter. So the other reason you want to do this is to figure out the structure of the book. Every single book has some kind of a structure. You can break it down and figure out what that is very easily by just kind of paging through the entire book. Now, our next step here, we want to think about the structure of textbook chapters. And when I say textbook chapters, I don't just mean textbooks. I also mean, in general, technical materials. And technical materials tend to have headings, subheadings, boldface words, pictures, diagrams, different bullet points. There's sometimes an objective at the beginning or an outline. There's charts all over the place. So we know they have this certain kind of a setup, and we can actually use that setup to our advantage. And that's what we're going to do when we discuss this multiple reading process. So our first step in the multiple reading process, or MRP for short, is the preview. The preview is simply reading, and keep in mind we're previewing a chapter right now. You read the introduction, the objectives and or outline that's at the beginning, and then you read the conclusion or maybe the questions at the end. So basically, you read something from the beginning and you read something from the end. Now, if you're a student and you have a homework assignment that includes answering questions at the end of the chapter, it might be a pretty good idea to read those questions before you start reading the chapter. And a lot of students don't do this. A lot of students, what they'll do is they'll just dive right in and start reading it beginning to end. And what I want you to avoid reading informational material beginning to end, especially technical material. We want to get an idea, what am I getting myself into? So that's the preview. And by the way, if you're taking notes, that's going to further enhance your ability to remember the information and also to comprehend the information, because when you're taking notes, you're making connections in your brain with different ideas. It depends really how long your chapter is, and also it depends on your purpose. I want you to know each one of these steps that we discuss depends on how much detail you really want. So if you really need to know your information inside out, bit by bit, detail for detail, it's a good idea to go through all of these steps comprehensively. And if you're reading something and you don't maybe need all that detail, your goal might be different. So you might not be taking notes after this step. But if you are trying to get the information very well, you might want to take notes. Now, eventually we're done with our overview, and we've got to move on to reading the chapter. Now, think of the advantage where you're at right now when you read the chapter and you've already done a preview and an overview. Think about how most people read a chapter. They start with step number 3. What we're advising here is to start with a preview and then an overview. And by the time you get to the third step of reading, what's going to happen to your reading speed? You think you might be able to read a little faster? Probably, if you know what to expect, right? And also, what about your comprehension? If you know what to expect throughout that chapter, your comprehension's probably going to be way better. And your retention is going to improve too, because you've had multiple steps. When I say multiple steps, we all know that what you remember is largely due to repetition. For example, when you remember the lyrics to a song, the way you remember the lyrics to a song is through repetition. You hear the song over and over again. With reading, we don't want to read a chapter over and over again, but we can get repetition in different ways. For example, when you preview, that's a repetition. When you take notes, that's a repetition. When you overview, that's a repetition. You take notes again, that's another repetition. By the time you're reading, you've had 5 different repetitions. Or if you're not taking notes, you've had 3 repetitions. So that'll help you remember the information better. And most importantly, you'll be able to comprehend. If you don't comprehend, there's nothing really to remember, right? So while you're reading, you want to read section by section, taking notes after each section or whenever you come across something that you really need to know well, or maybe you find something that's worthy of taking notes. Now, while we're reading through the material, a lot of people have a question, when exactly do I take notes? Some people, they take notes the moment that they read something important, and they'll take notes right away. There's a variety of ways you can do this. What I recommend, you take notes at the end of sections in your technical material. So, for example, when you get to a new heading or a new subheading, that's like a little break point where you can take a quick note on what you just read. Another idea is, let's say you're reading through a paragraph and you come across something that's really, really important. Well, what you want to do is wait until you finish the paragraph and then take the note. Don't take notes as in the middle of a paragraph. Try to wait until you get to the end, because then you can, at the end of a paragraph, then you could really figure out what is the most important thing here, what should I write down. Now, think about taking notes kind of like this. It's almost like a little break or an incentive. Or as this picture, I like when you reach a gummy bear, you get to eat it. Maybe you have been studying wrong all your life. Think of incentives or little breaks. When we can get to a certain point, we can stop for a moment, let our brain rest, and take a note. So I chose this picture because it kind of represents how I might take notes here and there. I might finish a paragraph and then take some notes. So you get to a gummy bear, you take some notes, or this is kind of a funny little reward system if you want to think about that. But taking notes is a form of a mental break. Even though you're doing a different kind of a mental activity, instead of reading, you're taking notes. And it's good to switch it up while you're reading. If you're just reading for a whole hour straight, your brain's going to get tired. Your brain is... It's really hard for your brain to focus on one particular task for more than 20 to 25 minutes. This is backed, by the way, by research in neuroscience. We have a really hard time focusing on one thing for more than 20-25 minutes. After that 25 minutes is up, our brain goes into decline in terms of its productivity and its effectiveness on dealing with the task. So, if you want to be reading effectively, it's a good idea to be reading a certain amount of time and then taking some notes. Reading for a certain amount of time, and that taking of notes is a form of a break. Now, how can you take notes? How should I take notes is the next question that I always get, because there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can take notes. What I recommend, my favorite way to take notes is through mind mapping. Mind mapping is a very non-linear, a very visual way to take notes. And the best way I could describe to you how to create a mind map is by creating a mind map, as you can see on the screen. So mind maps, as you can see, are very different from linear-based notes. Some people use mind mapping for brainstorming. Some people use it to take notes. Some people use it for their task management or project plans. I think mind mapping is a great way to take notes if you're reading technical material. So how you can do this within the process, by the way, if you're doing your preview, after you're done with your preview, you would add some notes. So your notes might be this middle part right here after the preview. When you get to the overview, that's when you start adding these other big concepts over all along the sides. These are big concepts. And then when you read, you start getting into the nitty-gritty details. So that's how you would create a mind map if you were reading technical material. Now, what other ways can you take notes? Well, you can also create an outline. All of us are familiar with outlines. I want you to know outlines can be useful if you have material that is very sequential or step-by-step, or it's for example, history is a good example. World War II should probably come after World War I, right? But not all information is formatted in a linear way or a step-by-step process. A lot of information is formatted where it's maybe a little better to do a mind map on it. For example, marketing. Marketing is really hard to create an outline. You can do it, but marketing lends itself a little better to mind mapping, because think about marketing. What would you put for number 1? Roman numeral 1. Roman numeral 2. I think all of us would agree you could put a number of things. Same thing with the topic of physics. What would you put for Roman numeral 1? Or the topic of law. There's all sorts of law. There's constitutional law, there's contract law, there's labor law, there's all sorts of law, and those kind of topics lend themselves better to mind maps. And the type of topics that are step-by-step, like history or very linear, are better for outline. So just know the type of material you're reading and what format would be better. Now, there's other options for taking notes. For example, you might want to take notes in your margin. That's another option. I'm not here to tell you the best way to take notes for all people. It depends on your goals. It depends on your style. So some people like to take notes in the margin. I've taken notes in the margin before too, where I simply want to summarize the text. So you can see here, these keywords, it's not meant to be very, very long. These are all very short phrases that kind of summarize the information. And you do that after each paragraph. So that's another way to take, if you're taking notes. Now, there's also highlighting. I get questions all the time. What about highlighting? Is it good? Is it bad? It depends on how you highlight. For example, this is good on the left, and this is bad. If you've ever bought a used college textbook, you know some people go a little crazy with highlighting. And how does excessive highlighting happen? Well, here's how it happens. Somebody is reading along, and somewhere midway through the paragraph, they realize, whoa, this is really important. I got to highlight it. So they highlight that sentence. And then they read the next sentence, and they realize, you know what, this sentence is kind of important too. So they highlight that one as well. And then they read the next sentence after that. And guess what? That sentence is way more important than the previous two. So I guess we got to highlight that one as well. Or maybe they might use a different color this time. And you can see where this is going. Highlighting immediately after you read a sentence is never a good idea. Try to wait until you get to the end of the paragraph and then make your notes. Or if you're going to be highlighting, make some highlights. And keep in mind, you don't need to highlight entire sentences. Why not just highlight one word or a phrase? As you can see on the left side, there's just phrases or keywords being highlighted there. It's not really excessive highlighting like the highlighting you see on the right. And also keep in mind, the point of highlighting is to kind of lift something off the page. So if you're highlighting everything, it kind of dilutes the importance of highlighting. Now, how do we not take notes? Well, don't take notes like this. And what I mean by that is having generally no strategy. I've taken notes like this. In high school, I used to take notes like this all the time, just to pass the time. I'd be taking notes, and you ever have that situation where you take notes, and then you look at your notes, and you can't even read them. There's no organization to them. You don't know what's page 1, page 2, unless it's in a notebook. And it's really, really hard to, look back and find these notes useful later on. So that's why I'm recommending having some sort of a strategy. And whether that's highlights, whether that's notes in the margin, whether that's outlines or mind mapping, you need to have some kind of a strategy rather than just taking notes like this. So let's get back to reading. I want to talk about some more tips for reading technical material. While you're going through, when you're reading the material, we are going to be taking notes here and there if we want to improve our comprehension, but we don't want to spend too much time taking notes, which is why I recommended doing it maybe at the end of a section or at the end of the paragraph, and writing keywords down instead of long sentences. But as you're reading, another thing you need to keep in mind is you need to adjust your reading speed. The easiest way to do this is to make sure you're using your hand as a guide, or your finger, or a pen, and you're simply going to be going, left to right, line by line. Of course, that's if you're reading in English. In English, we go left to right. Not all languages go left to right when they read. But when you're reading along, you can adjust your reading speed to improve your comprehension. So I generally recommend you slow down on the first sentence of a paragraph and then speed up a little bit after that first sentence. Now, some people like to do this in two ways. They'll slow down on the first sentence, and then they'll speed up a little, and then when they get to the end of the paragraph, they slow down a little. That's certainly a valid strategy. That works a little better when you have very long paragraphs. It doesn't work as well when you have very short paragraphs, because sometimes you might only have 3 or 4 sentences. So if you're constantly slowing down and speeding up at the beginning and end, that might be a little too tedious. But slowing down in the first sentence of a paragraph is a great idea to get better comprehension, because that first sentence usually has the main idea or the topic sentence, and it's going to help you get better comprehension, because it also helps you focus while you're reading through. If you're using your hand, as you get to the end of a paragraph, you start realizing, you know what, I got a new idea coming up. Let me slow down a little bit. Let me carefully get that idea. Now let me speed up. It's almost like you're taking the idea and trying to run with it. And I want you to think of it just like driving a car. When you drive a car, do you always drive at the same speed? Or do you change it up? Everybody changes it up. If you're in traffic, you got to slow down. If it's an open highway, you're going to speed up if there's no traffic. When you're turning, you slow down. So keep in mind with your reading, you need to do the same thing. And also, not just on the first sentences. Let's say you're reading along and you get to a page where maybe your teacher discussed this in class, or you're already familiar with the information. That's a good point where you should try to speed up a little bit. Why? Because you're already familiar with that information. And by the way, when I say speed up, I don't mean speed up to the point where you can't understand anything that you're reading. I mean speed up, kind of like accelerating. And when I say slow down, I don't mean slow down to an extremely slow pace. I mean go at a speed that is careful enough for you to really grasp the concept, and then try to take it and run with it. See if you could go a little faster. So adjusting your reading speed is a very good way to get better comprehension. Now, what about when we get into diagrams and charts? So this is an issue a lot of readers run into. You run into a diagram, maybe a picture, or a chart, or formula that you need to analyze. And it's really confusing, kind of like the diagram you see on your screen right now. And we have trouble sometimes reading, you know how it looks. You're reading along and it says refer to figure 2.4. And 2.4 might be on another page and you got to look at it. And sometimes we read that whole paragraph, we look at the diagram, and we have no clue what's going on. Why? Because sometimes those diagrams can be very, very complex, and you have a whole paragraph explaining it. The way I recommend you deal with diagrams or charts or formulas is while you're reading along, the moment that it says refer to figure 2.4, you stop reading and you look at 2.4, whatever the diagram or chart is. And when you look at that diagram, you're just getting, a first impression of it. You're not trying to figure it out detail by detail. They told you to look at figure 2.4, you'd look at it, and then you go back to reading. And the next sentence might say, figure 2.4 shows the relationship between blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. You stop reading again, leave your hand or your finger there, and you look at the diagram and see, okay, is that true? So they just gave you a piece of information, and you want to verify it visually. You ever hear the expression, a picture is worth 1,000 words? Think about how much comprehension you get when you read a sentence that tells you something about a diagram, and then you see that happening in the diagram. That enhances your comprehension greatly. And then you go back to where you left off in the paragraph, and you read the next sentence, and it might say, additionally, figure 2.4 also shows the relationship between blah, blah, blah. You stop again reading, and you look at that diagram. So I realize this seems like a very choppy way to read, but it's the best way to read if you're going to be dealing with a lot of diagrams, charts, formulas, and you're trying to really get as much comprehension as you possibly can. It's way better than doing what most people do. Most people read this entire paragraph, this ginormous paragraph. They get to the end, and then they look at the diagram, and they have no clue what's going on. Well, why is that? Because the whole paragraph was telling them tons of detail and assuming they were looking at the diagram while they were reading it. However, if they're just reading through, by the time they get to the end and look at that diagram, it's going to be incredibly confusing to them because they weren't following along. So again, you read a sentence, refer to the diagram. Read another sentence, refer to the diagram. And by the way, this refers to charts, this refers to formulas, or anything that you have to look at and analyze. What about dealing with footnotes? This is a common question that comes up. You're reading through a sentence and you come across like this footnote right here. Some people, they jump right to the bottom. That's probably not a good idea. I would finish the paragraph first, and then if you really need to know the information inside out, or you're curious to know what the footnotes say, then you might want to look at the footnotes. Sometimes when I'm reading along, I'm just skipping through footnotes. It depends on your purpose and how much detail you need to get. Now, footnotes don't always look like this. Sometimes footnotes are, instead of just sources, sometimes they're entire paragraphs giving you more detail, like this one right here. Now, this is just some sample text, but sometimes we're reading through and there's a footnote, and at the bottom we have this paragraph of text that's giving you much more detail. Usually, the reason why it's there as a footnote and not in the paragraph is because this is just additional information. It's kind of like, well, in case you're interested, here's some more information about this topic or this sentence that we just discussed. So a lot of times footnotes are optional reading, But again, if you're trying to get full understanding and maximize your comprehension, then you might want to be reading that, but you want to save it until you finish the paragraph before you read that footnote. So make sure you're doing that. Now, another common thing when we're reading technical material is rereading material. How do we avoid rereading material? And what I recommend you try doing is something called strategic rereading. So here's the problem that a lot of people do while they're reading. You ever have a situation where you read a sentence and you're like, you know what, I didn't quite understand that sentence. Let me read it again. You read the sentence again and you still don't understand it. You ever read the same stupid sentence like 7 or 8 times and it's just not getting into your head? And this is very frustrating. Now, this is an example of rereading when you should not be rereading. You're pointlessly rereading. What I mean by that is you should never reread after reading just one sentence. Here's why. First of all, let's think about the options. You read one sentence. It's possible that maybe you were not focused. But it's also possible maybe that person that wrote it didn't write it clearly. Maybe that happened. Here's a third possibility. Sometimes when you're reading, that sentence that you just read makes no sense until you read the next sentence or when you read the rest of the paragraph. So keep that in mind. Sometimes, you could reread that sentence 1,000,000 times and you'll never understand it because you need to read the next sentence or the rest of the paragraph to fully understand the idea. I want you to think of paragraphs as ideas within themselves. Don't think of every single sentence or every single word has to be understood perfectly because it all fits into the context of an entire paragraph. So when should you reread the material? If you read a whole paragraph and you didn't understand what you just read, then it's a good idea to go back and reread. But if you read that one sentence and you feel like you didn't understand it perfectly, try to push through it because sometimes you can get the information later on. It's just like when you're watching a movie. I'm sure you've watched movies that are a little confusing at the beginning, right? Now, you probably don't stop your DVD player and decide, let's rewatch that scene because we didn't quite understand it. Usually you just kind of go with the flow. You continue watching the movie, and at the end of the scene or at the end of the movie, you start realizing, oh, this explains what was happening earlier. And by the way, the same thing happens with reading. The same way information is presented where they tell you one thing and it's explained later on. So try to avoid rereading material after one sentence. Now, one other way that we could do some strategic reading is through the next step that we're going to talk about in our multiple reading process, and that's what we do after we're done reading. And this is where strategic rereading comes into play, because when we're done reading, it's kind of like, what do we do now? At this point, some people just stop reading, and if you really need to maximize your comprehension, it might be a good idea to do step number 4, which is a final review. The final review is your point where you can strategically reread something that maybe you didn't understand fully before. Or maybe it was an area of the text that you were reading through and you felt like, I'm not completely clear on that. So this is where you reread any sections you didn't understand. One other way to do a final review that's very quick, it'll take you less than 1 minute in most material, you just reread the headings, subheadings, and boldface words. Now, some people will say, well, I already did that. Why would I do it again? For the sake of repetition, to make sure that you understood all those things. So this could be very quick. It's kind of like repeating step number 2. Remember in the overview, we were reading the headings and subheadings and boldface words. During the final review, you could just repeat that. And the reason why that's useful is because you're overviewing all of that material one last time in your head. And sometimes what will happen is you'll get to maybe a heading and you'll say to yourself, you know what? I thought I understood that information, but actually I don't think I do. Maybe I should reread that section one more time. And this is what we were talking about earlier, about strategic rereading. This is where you're done reading and now you're rereading parts that you really need to know, maybe for a test. Maybe you really need to know it for a presentation that you're doing. So that's where your final review comes in. Now, also, what if you have to memorize something? This is where you would do it. The final review is the point where you would try to memorize anything. Sometimes you have diagrams that you have to memorize, lists that you have to memorize. And by the way, we'll have a video in this comprehension course on how to memorize information. So we'll discuss that. That's a topic in itself. That will be in another video. Refer to the how to memorize information that you read video. So this is where you would do it if you had to memorize. You don't want to try memorizing while you're reading, because while you're reading, you're seeking to comprehend. You're trying to get comprehension while you're reading. You can't do both at the same time. You can't comprehend and also try to memorize at the same time. Memorization should be done after we're done reading. So, what's the next step? Well, there's a fifth step, and you can talk about what you just read, or you can try teaching it to someone. There's a quote that I love, and I truly believe in: teach once, learn twice. Anytime you try to teach somebody something that you just learned, you essentially learn that information 2 times. And the reason why this is so important to me, that's what I do for a living. I teach. I love sharing information. And the other reason why I love sharing information, it helps other people out, but it also helps me out, because when I'm sharing and teaching, I'm also learning everything that I learned before once again. So keep in mind, when you're done reading, if you can talk to somebody about what you just read or teach somebody what you just read, that is going to improve your comprehension. It's going to improve your retention of the material as well. Now, once you're done with that, you've finished this multiple reading process. So congratulations, you've just read a textbook or some technical material with some solid comprehension. So if you have any questions about what we just went over, and I realize, by the way, that not all material is going to be as clear-cut as what I was talking about. You might have some very customized material that is very detail-oriented, or maybe it's structured in a different way. If you have any questions about your particular material and you want some tips on it, by all means, feel free to get in touch with me directly. My contact information is on the screen right now. It's paul@irisreading.com. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter. But I want to thank you for attending this webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.